and as a result achieves a two-dart pattern once again. In the front, the waist dart is retained. However, the fullness above the bust has been shifted from the chest area to the underarm area. In the back, instead of a shoulder dart, we will develop a neck dart. Moving the dart position from the chest area on this bodice frees that area of the body and allows for many styling possibilities. The basic neckline is a fine background for jewelry or accessories, and therefore is called the jewel neckline. A popular variation of a lower rounded line is the scoop neckline. The square neckline is interesting too. The V neckline is a classic. A romantic variation is the sweetheart neckline. Although the basic bodice shows the waist dart, designers often use the fullness as stitched tucks, soft tucks, or shirring. To prepare for this bodice, we proceed in the same manner as for bodice 1. The length is from the neck rim to the waistline plus 4 inches. The width is across the bust from center front to side seam plus 4 inches. Then we proceed to mark in the grain lines. The grain lines will be the exact position as bodice 1. However, the method I shall use will be marking it in with the ruler. Starting along one of the lengthwise edges, let's draw in the lengthwise grain using the ruler and laying the ruler parallel with the lengthwise grain. Using the line at the middle of the ruler, 1 inch from the edge, will give you a 1-inch margin all in one continuous line. The cross grain is placed at the middle of the full length of the block, which we can achieve just by folding it in half. At that level, we will mark in the cross grain. In order to identify the cross grain accurately, measure from the outer edge of either end, which is the cross grain thread. Starting at the center cross mark, draw or dot at intervals along the full width of the muslin and use those dots as your guide to achieve the cross grain marking. By measuring accurately, you will identify imbalances that may not have been previously clear when you draw in your grain line. And at that point, you can proceed to adjust it once again. The cross grain is in. We want to come back to the center and measure from the center to identify your apex level. The measurement of your apex from center to apex to the figure at cross grain, place a cross mark for apex. We would like to know what the middle of the side panel is. Measure from apex to side seam plus 1/8 of an inch ease, divide it in half, and transfer it to the muslin. This is exactly as you did for the bodice 1. Remember, however, that all measures are to be taken on the draping side of the figure. At the middle, another cross mark. Then we will draw the length grain down to the bottom of the block from those cross marks. To get an accurate lengthwise grain, come back to the outer edge of your muslin and measure from the edge to the apex at bust level, from the edge to the same measure at the lower level of the block, and draw in your grain line. The same procedure for the second cross mark. That completes the marking of the front. For the back, again, we will start with the lengthwise grain 1 inch from the edge. Identify the base of the neck 3 inches down from the top. Identify your position at shoulder blade and cross mark at that center grain line. Remember, the shoulder blade level is determined by using the measure equal to 1/4 of the length of the center back seam. Using the cross mark to start your measure, come back to the top and place dots across the muslin as you did for the front cross grain. And draw the cross grain all the way to the end. Measure from the center center back to the ridge and add 1/4 of an inch for ease. Cross mark. Come back towards the center back 1 1/4 inches and place another cross mark at the shoulder blade as well. Then at that second cross mark we will draw a lengthwise grain down to the bottom. To achieve the correct measure, once again, measure from the edge to the cross mark at the level of the shoulder blade and at the bottom of the muslin. And draw the lengthwise grain in. Having drawn this lengthwise grain, we have now completed the draping of the marking of the back and placed together in this manner, you have both the back and the front prepared to drape. The draping procedure, however, is just a bit different. However, the start of the draping is not different on any bodice. Place apex cross mark at apex figure. Secure with 2 pins, one with the head up and one with the head down. Okay? Smooth up towards the shoulder, bringing the lengthwise grain parallel to the center front seam. At the base of the neck, bring the cross grain parallel to the floor and secure at the base of the neck. Pin halfway down to the apex level. Smooth around the neckline for the process of draping the neck. Cut away some of the excess to release the tension. Press against the seam to identify the seam line with a nail impression. Slash around the neckline to release additional tension. Check the neck to make sure that the grains are in balance at the base of the neck across the chest and coming up from the bust level to the neck-shoulder intersection. Cross grain should be parallel to the floor, and length grain should run straight up the body towards the neck intersection. Smooth the muslin towards the ridge of the shoulder at the armhole. Secure with a pin at the seam. If there is any strain, we could slash in at mid-shoulder to release whatever minimal strain there is. Now, smooth around the armhole, bringing the muslin against the figure, but not so tight that it distorts the muslin. Lightly around the ridge and secure the muslin
at the bottom of the plate, outside of the side seam, at the outside of the side seam. The upper portion of the bodice has been draped. Now the lower portion of the bodice is ready for fitting. Now, going back to the fact that this is a basic bodice and we want the structure to be retained, the balance to be retained, at this point we would have to bring the length of the cross grain into balance. You'll notice that from apex to side seam the cross grain is shooting downward and that the length grain from bust level is shooting outward. We would like to bring the lengthwise grain up into perpendicular position. And to help us do that, creasing at the cross grain becomes very helpful. Okay. When you bring the length grain into perpendicular position, hold it at the side seam and at the midpoint of the dart at position of lengthwise grain to get the appropriate control. Pin at the side seam and at the length grain position. And check balance. You will notice that the balance has been overcorrected. It's important that you step back in order to see the balance in appropriate perspective. When you're in too close, sometimes it's difficult to see. Took up too much in the dart, overcorrected the balance of the length grain. When you're working in the lower area of the body this way, it's helpful to lift the figure. You get a better perspective of the grain balance. The lengthwise grain is now perpendicular. Once in the perpendicular position, bring it back against the body towards the waistline tape. Pick up a pinch at the tape level and then pin to secure the position. If there's a strain in pinning at that point, perhaps the pin has been pulled, the muslin has been pulled down too tightly. Raise it a thread and check. We want to finish this draping of the side seam at this point. Smooth over to the side seam, place a pin at waistline side seam intersect. And at this point you will notice there is a puffing out at the hip. And that's because the hip is resisting the muslin and the muslin requires slashing. Slash to within about a ½ inch of the waistline. Check the fit at the underarm to make sure you haven't pinned too tight. And now the side portion of the bodice has been draped. At the center, near the waistline dart, we have the remaining excess muslin to control into and placing it into the waistline dart. Before we pick up at the waistline dart, however, let's finish the draping of the lower portion of the bodice, lining up lengthwise grain at center of the body, secure at waistline and up towards bust line. What is left now will be controlled and pinned into the body. Secure more accurately by creasing on the grain line before you pin through for complete pickup. At this point, the draping of the bodice has been completed. The next step, before you take the bodice off, you would want to mark the seam lines and the intersections of the seam lines on the figure. Before you do that, however, check the draping, check your grain balances to make sure that you've draped properly, and then you can go on to do your marking. The major checkpoint to begin with is at the chest, at the midriff. In the area from center front over towards princess, at that mid-body area, check to see that the cross grain is parallel to the floor. If you have a diagonal pull, that pull signifies grain imbalance. And we would stop to check out to see what correction is necessary. If you still have an imbalance in the length grain, it would require an adjustment in the pickup of the dart at the bust line so that you can release some of the fullness to put it back into the waist dart. And therefore, that fullness that you took out of the bust dart would be shifted into the waist dart. So you see how they relate to each other. To check the neck and shoulder, again, make sure the grain is parallel to the floor. Cross grain, length grain straight up, and that the shoulder area is not strained too tightly. That happens very often. The marking process may start at the base of the neck. Cross mark at the base of the neck, dot around the seam line at the neck, cross mark, neckline, seam, shoulder seam, for neckline, shoulder intersection. Don't dot the shoulder seam. That seam will be a straight line connecting from neck to ridge when you get it on the table. Just move right out to the end of the shoulder, mark the shoulder seam and the ridge line for the shoulder ridge intersect. There. To mark the armhole, we will start at the shoulder and mark the ridge down towards the screw level, as you see here, stopping at lower screw level. At screw level, we will mark the edge of the plate. Crease with your nail so that you can see that impression, and mark starting at the screw level so that the dot of the ridge and the first dash of the plate are at the same point. Cross mark at the outside of the side seam intersecting plate for the plate side seam intersection. The side seam will not be marked at all. We will go right down from the plate to the waistline and intersect according to the tape side seam position. Dot along the tape to the dart. Cross mark. It's easier to lift now. Cross mark on the pin for dart position and intersect cross mark at the tape. Cross mark on the other side of the dart, intersect at the tape. Dot to within about 1.5 inches of center, and then cross mark at middle of tape. The waistline has been marked. Now we want to mark the underarm dart as well. Mark the underarm dart on either side on the pin at the side seam and on either side at the pin at the midpoint where the grain line, lengthwise grain, is positioned. You do not have to intersect the side seam at the dart position because once the dart is trued, we will close it and draw a straight line from plate to waistline. The last thing we would want to do here is to identify the vanishing point of the dart. Estimate, look at the figure, see how your waist dart travels up the body, and at the point it disappears, place a pin at the vanishing point. You may mark it if you wish, but my personal preference is to place a pin at that location temporarily until we true on the table. On the side dart, we will follow the contour of the body and estimate the vanishing point of the dart based on the contour of the body. And you can see that as the body curves, the dart begins to become shorter. The curve of the bust faces out, the curve of the midriff faces in. These different curves will affect how the dart shapes and the length of the dart. Vanishing point of the dart is just about there. Okay? We're now ready to remove the muslin from the figure to proceed to the next process of drawing in your final lines, connecting all of your intersections, and of course, you remember from your last demonstration that is the process we call truing. Before we go further, let's review on the flat what we've marked on the figure. At the base of the neck, a cross mark to intersect center front. Dot around the neckline seam to shoulder neckline intersection. Cross mark at shoulder ridge intersection. Dot down the ridge to screw level. Dash around the edge of the plate to underarm. Cross mark underarm seam and plate. Cross mark on both sides of the pickup at the bust, on the pin, at side seam, on the pin
at middle of dart and the vanishing point. Cross mark the underarm seam and the waistline seam. Dot along the tape. Cross mark both sides of the waist dart pickup on the pin at either side and cross mark at the waistline tape. Dot halfway over to center front. No other markings until we begin to true. In truing at the neck. Square off at base of neck and draw in the original neckline seam. Remember that this neck on the seam is not a comfortable position, and in order to adjust for the comfort, even if we wanted a high neckline, we will come down the 1/4 of an inch or the 3/8 of an inch as the variable exists in industry. And so we will come down and redo a lowered neckline at the front, at the center position, but smoothing and blending back to the original neck position within about an inch of the shoulder seam. Remember to square off at the base of the neck to assure a rounded line rather than a pointed line. Now, the shoulder seam requires just a line, straight line, to connect from neck to armhole. In order to complete the underarm seam, we must true out the underarm dart, close it, and then mark in that underarm seam. So, let's proceed to the underarm dart. Connect to touch the cross marks at the side seam, the cross mark at the midpoint, and the vanishing point. When you lay your ruler into that position, if your ruler touches all 3 positions, then you know that your dart will be a straight-sided dart. And if that's the case, we can just proceed to complete the dart by marking the other side as well. Be sure to place a cross mark at the end of every dart to clearly define the vanishing point. At another time, you might find that when you line up your ruler to connect with the 3 points, that the middle cross mark does not flow with the ruler. That would suggest that the dart is not a straight dart, that it will have to be curved. This type of curve might occur when the body that you're working on is especially round, and in that case needs more fullness. When that happens, you use your curve, your hip curve, and shift the curve so that it flows with the direction of the cross marks. Draw in one side, and using the markings on the curve to help you keep the curve in the same position, turn it over and mark the other side to achieve balance and symmetry. And in that way, we have curved the dart to accommodate the requirements of the figure. Now we'll true the waist dart. Connect from vanishing point to waistline intersection. Having completed the truing of both darts, we can return to the bust dart, close it so that we can true the side seam. When closing a dart running horizontally across the body, we pin from the lower side of the dart up to the top of the dart. Crease on the lower dart line, to vanishing point, and bring up towards the upper dart line. Okay? Now, in order to prevent the possibility of stretching one side of the dart in this area especially, which is so biased, in order to prevent that stretching, which can happen very easily, just notice as I run my hand against the table, the lower portion of the muslin begins to turn and stretch. You will notice that the grains at the edge of the muslin do not line up. The bottom of the dart extends beyond that of the top. To prevent this distortion, secure the dart at the outer edges first, aligning the grains, and then proceed to complete the pinning. Pin at the tip to start, then come out to the end and pin at the end to secure grain, and then continue to pin along the dart at intervals, but avoid at this time placing a pin in the area that you will be truing the side seam. Now that the dart is closed, connect a straight line from the waistline intersection to the plate side intersection, and draw in the side seam. This is your body line. Once the line has been drawn, place a pin at the location of the line, and then respace your pins so that they are placed at even intervals. Having drawn the body line, which doesn't have any ease, doesn't allow for ease, we now again come down the inch and out the half to allow the ease required for comfort in setting in the sleeve. Come down the inch and out a half, and draw in the extended side seam to that mark And now we are ready to draw in the armhole. When you draw the armhole, you must touch the shoulder ridge, the midpoint between the ridge dot and the plate mark, and the drop point at side seam. Adjust your curve and shift it so that the curve will smoothly blend from those 3 points. At the bottom, near the armhole, near the side seam, the curve should square off with the extended line. And blend in to the curve of the armhole. The bodice has now been trued except for the waistline. The waistline will not be trued at this time. We'll save that portion until the back has been draped and trued and pinned together at the underarm for a complete truing of the waistline at that time. However, before we can put this back on the form, we will trim away the excess muslin wherever possible. And that's at the neckline, at the shoulder, at the armhole. We will not trim away the side seam, as we will be balancing the side seam of the front to the back in the area below the dart. At the neckline, a 1/2 inch seam allowance. One inch at the shoulder. A 1/2 inch in the upper portion of the armhole. Allowing the lower portion to remain at 1 inch so that we will not cut away the marking of the plate at this time. This marking is important for reference when we put it back on the figure to drape the back. Now we're ready to close the waist dart so that we can put the bodice back on the form to prepare for the draping of the back. when you replace the bodice on the form, be sure to put back your pinch. There is a strain in the waistline at this point, which can be removed by slashing once again. If in placing this bodice on the form at this time, you find that the cross marks don't place where they should, or the seams need adjusting, this is the time to remark for corrected truing. However, once the bodice is placed into position and the remarkings have been made, remove the pins from the shoulder and sink them into the body beyond the seam line, leaving the seam line clear for placing the back on top of it so that you can mark the back seam line according to the trued line of the front. In the side seam, after you have placed the body into position, in order to expose the side seam to allow the back to be draped freely, we will turn back the muslin, holding it into position about an inch away from the side seam, and turn the muslin back. Once done, we are ready to drape the back bodice.